I'm thrilled to welcome two people who truly represent America's future. You all know Pete Buttigieg, Mayor Pete, the Rhodes Scholar from South Bend, Indiana, who enlisted in the US Navy, served in Afghanistan, and this year became the first openly gay person to win a presidential primary or a caucus. Joining Pete is Stacey Abrams, an LBJ school alum, who served as the first African-American woman leader of either party in the Georgia House of Representatives. Stacey served for 11 years, including 7 as Democratic leader. Last year, as the Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia, she won more votes than any other Democrat in the state's history. Stacey and Pete are still in the early stages of remarkable careers of public service, and they are with us today to share lessons learned and visions for a future of democracy based on belonging and empowering everyone. Hello, Stacey. Hello, Pete. It's so wonderful to have you here with us on our 50th anniversary. You know, President Johnson always talked about thinkers and doers. And in front of us today are two of the most incredible thinkers and doers of this generation, of your generation. And I'm so pleased to have you. Each of you came to public service in a very different way. Stacey, you came through, running for office and through your public service in the state of Georgia. And Pete, you went through the military and then went back to South Bend and went back to Indiana and South Bend and ran for office. What moved you to actually step into public service? Was it something that you saw? Was it something that you felt you were born with? What really moved each of you to come into public service and to stay in it? So I'm going to start with Stacey.
Mine was indoctrination. My parents were working class, and for them to take care of each other was really about service, that no matter how little we had, there was someone with less. Your job was to serve that person. For me, that evolved into wanting to understand government, because as righteous and wonderful as my parents were, these two parents and their 6 kids weren't going to fix the challenges we saw in the Deep South. And so I really focused on how did government play a role? What role did the nonprofit space have? And how could I intersect those two to help create the world that I wanted? So I started out as a bureaucrat working for the city of Atlanta as an attorney. And when I realized politicians wouldn't necessarily do what you told them, I decided to run for office and join them myself.
That's great. Pete, how about you?
Well, I grew up in a family that we weren't politically connected. I don't remember ever meeting an elected official growing up, but very politically aware. My parents were always glued to the TV, sometimes yelling at the TV. And so I grew up with a sense of the importance of kind of world affairs and national affairs. Got to college and was kind of soaked in a lot of the lore around the Kennedy presidency. Only to realize as I came home that so much of where politics really matters is a much more intimate local level. My city had been written off as a dying city. We'd been through a lot since the loss of the factories that really dated back to the 60s. And found myself part of this generation that cared about the place, that said, we can either keep complaining, keep leaving, or do something about it. And began to realize that there was a chance to actually take things into our own hands. And that was the kind of trajectory that led to my running for mayor, but also building an administration with people from largely from my generation, as well as people who've been in public service for longer, all of whom wanted to see our community change. And I think that that kind of perspective, having studied politics at the kind of national and international level as a student, but then done it and lived it at a local level, really shaped my understanding of what it means to be involved in public service, whether it's political or otherwise. And I try to carry that with me now, even as we have these kind of world historical moments swirling around us.
I know both of you have been thinking about this for a long time. A lot of it has to do with your surroundings and your family and all the people that you've come in contact with. And one of the things I find that, especially among young people and in schools who are actually studying to work in the public policy, is failure. They're not used to failing. They're used to succeeding. And when they fail, they feel like, They don't really know how quite to recover from that failure. And I know both of you have had failures in your political careers. So can you talk a little bit about how you cope with the failures and how that's changed you as a person and as somebody who's working in a very difficult situation in terms of the bows and arrows that come at you almost every day in a political arena. So Mayor Pete, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think, honestly, the business world does a better job of recognizing that success and failure together are part of how innovation works and how growth comes. Politics a little less so, just because I think the narratives are less forgiving. And so, before my first successful campaign, I ran for state treasurer of Indiana. It's a long story how I got involved, but basically it was a fight over whether the Obama administration had done the right thing in rescuing the auto industry. The incumbent believed that that was the wrong thing to do and actually tried to block the auto rescue, which would have been catastrophic here in Indiana. And I thought somebody needed to stand up to them. And so I ran, not really knowing what was involved in that, built a campaign. Nobody'd heard of me. Almost nobody had heard of the office I was seeking. And this was 2010. So you can imagine this is one of the worst years for Democrats ever, running as a Democrat in a deeply red state on a platform of defending the then unpopular Obama-Biden economic policy. And fairly predictably, I got crushed. It was like 60-40, not even close. And I learned a lot from that. First of all, I learned how to campaign, win or lose. But I also learned that the sun comes up the next day and you're still you. And when you dust yourself off from having put everything that you have into a campaign and tried to bring as many people as you could along with you, and recognize that you're still the same person when you get up in the morning, and that the same things you care about still matter. It I think helps you get that thicker skin that's really important for politics. So if somebody can get through a career in public service without ever having a major defeat, that's great. And at the same time, mine, and unlike what Stacey experienced, I was beat fair and square, to be clear. And that was as instructive a campaign as any of the winning campaigns that I ran afterwards.
I think one of the things you just hit on, Mayor Pete, is exactly what we were trying to think about in terms of school. How do you give people the experience of failure, getting thick skin, getting scarred, and then not taking it personally? You start thinking about how you can grow a character, how you can take that failure and make something good out of that failure. And Stacey, you know about that. So Stacey, why don't you talk to us about your experiences?
Well, I think Pete's absolutely right that there is a difference in industry and in spaces how failure operates. But I think it's also important that we acknowledge failure operates differently for communities of color, for women, for the disadvantaged, because often you get one shot. And the presumption is if you couldn't leverage that shot, then clearly you weren't capable. Or worse, if someone who looked like you had that shot and didn't accomplish it, none of you were eligible. I think my most public failure is probably one of the examples of how I've learned to navigate it, which was I ran for governor. I ran a very competitive campaign. We transformed the composition of the electorate in ways that no one had seen in the South in decades. And yet I had an opponent who also leveraged his power to ensure his victory. My response was to be very intentional about creating a new space to stand in. And I think what was interesting or different certainly about my reaction was that I think we also have to parse out what failure looks like. So I gave my non-concession speech where I acknowledged the legal sufficiency. No matter what happened, no matter how it came about, I didn't become governor. And that means I failed. It means I didn't get the thing I was going for. And it's entirely possible to acknowledge that something didn't occur, but to also investigate what could have been done differently. And I think one way that Pete and I are so similar, and when we met in 2016, one of the moments of sort of connectivity was there's a lesson in that, but there's also opportunity in that. And so for me, I had plenty of time on my hands. I took the next 2 years to build organizations to tackle the very concerns that I faced as a candidate. Pete and I don't get to hide the things that have happened. We don't get to pretend. Often you get to fail in silence, but when you fail on national television, it's a big deal. And so part of, I think, the lesson to be gleaned is there's a utility to failure, but you have to understand all of its contours. It's not black and white. And there is both a comfort in it, but there's also a power in it. Because when you can use that lesson, when you can extract opportunity, and then when you can convert those opportunities into changes that help someone else not make those mistakes or not face those challenges, then that's where service really enters the space.
What you just said, I was thinking about asking you all about the American people and what you've learned in terms of all the campaigns and all the people that you've met through all of your journeys. But something you just said, Stacey, made me think of something else. When you think about failure, you know, people can relate to failure. Everyone has failed. It's a very human kind of feeling. So that's one way to connect with people. The other thing is how you use those failures to educate people about systems and structures and organizational weaknesses. And I think this is something you're touching upon, how you can use the totality of all of your experiences to help educate the American public, not only about you, but about our democracy. So what I'd like to talk about a little bit is you've been around and seen a lot of people, a lot of Americans in a lot of different situations. What do you see as some of the enduring qualities of Americans, no matter where you go? What are you seeing of some of the commonalities of the American people? Pete?
Well, one thing that I see everywhere I go is a level of just what I would call maybe values on how to do things. So before you get to our political values, our ideological values, just a sense of a desire for fairness and a desire to be regarded that I think in the right way could bind together a lot of constituencies that are wedged off against each other in various ways right now. But that actually have so much in common. And, you know, one of the things I would always be on the lookout for, especially when I was running for president, was any kind of gap or difference or daylight between the things I was asked about most by reporters and the things I was asked about most by voters. And sometimes it was a very specific issue area. And a good example is mental health. I was asked constantly about mental health and addiction by voters, much less so by commentators and reporters. But also in addition to individual policies, I think a deeper sense that brought people together of wanting the system to just work for them and recognizing all the ways that it doesn't, whether it's ways in which our economic arrangements don't actually reward hard work in the proportion that you would expect, or support people in their ability to thrive in the way that many people, I think, just assume programs do, and the political system that we have such a deep, unwritten need to have trust in that's being shaken in so many ways and has been for years. In some cases, that trust was never properly built in the first place. In others, it's been eroded, sometimes systematically. And it's one thing I'm very concerned about as we enter into the final phases of this year's presidential campaign. What I find among people is a desire to get those systems to somehow correspond to their everyday lived reality, to see the decisions being made in big white buildings actually line up with their everyday lives and the vulnerability all of us have to the power flexed in those halls and the consequences of the decisions that are made. And my wish for politics, and part of what I'm trying to, the direction I'm trying to push our politics into. And by the way, one of the reasons I really admire the work that Stacey does in her insistence that we have a political system that is more fair and more trustworthy is that it's up to us. The great paradox of our time is a lot of institutions that have failed to be fully representative of us will only become that way if we use them, rickety though they are, to fix them. This quality of our systems to be responsive, imperfectly, but to be responsive to demands that they be improved. That's the entire ballgame, right? And the big question is, will we be able to use those levers that were built into the system? Will we be able to grab hold of it to fix it before it's too late?
Stacey, do you want to talk about this from your perspective?
I think what I would add is that we exist in a nation of multi-strand identities, and there is a deeper empathy that exists among us when we are willing to acknowledge those strands and how they intersect, how they weave together. When I was running for office in Georgia, we have 159 states. Georgia is physically the largest state east of the Mississippi, if you don't count the water in Florida. But what that meant was that I was going to places where they fought Civil War battles and were very unhappy with the outcome of the war. Places where communities were denied access and agency and humanity for much of the nation's existence, and communities that are newly formed, having immigrated to the United States and are growing fast. And there's this notion that those are separate communities that have nothing in common except they all live here. And I think if you extrapolate from that, sort of the larger national narrative. But what I found when I was running, and I'm sure Pete saw this too, was that when you pulled one of those threads, when it was the mental health thread, or it was worrying about your children thread, or it was the healthcare thread, or even just, do I have an opportunity to think, to dream, that we are all more connected by those pieces. And unfortunately, our politics have created this tension that says for you to pull on your thread means that someone else has to yank it back, instead of thinking about how our politics can try to knit those things together and offer policies, but also offer frameworks for how we talk about these things. My politics, but also my American patriotism, is grounded in this notion that my responsibility is to see how my threads can weave together with yours. And more importantly, how when we push them all together, we all become strengthened by these multiple identities, that we don't have to separate them out. I cannot be just Black or just a woman or just Southern. I am inherently all of those things, and those things have made me who I am. Those experiences have informed how I engage, and I have to be kind enough and empathetic enough to understand that the same thing is true for every person I see. And I think the one example that resonated for me was I was in North Georgia, which is largely white, largely rural, having a conversation about criminal justice reform. And I had the same conversation no matter where I went. And this older white man came up to me and he said, are you thinking about my son too? And I said, of course I am. And the question that he was asking, and I'm bringing race into this because I think it's one of those dimensions that we too often elide, that looms until we have to confront it. But what he did, what he wanted to know is, could I see the identity that he had of a grieving father struggling with a child who had an opioid addiction that was consonant with my role as a sister who is grieving for my brother who was having his own challenges. And in that moment, we had a commonality that transcended our politics, transcended our region. I don't know if he voted for me or not, but I know in that moment, I gave him a connectivity that said that we were both American, we were both Georgian, we were both human, and our needs could work together to make our country better.
One of the things that both of you have touched upon is this idea of commonality. And you talked about it in terms of the people you've seen, the people you've met, your experiences. I want to translate that to how do you take that and move it to a political structure? So both of you have been in elected offices where you've had to achieve something, you've had to work with those who are in opposition, whether in your own party or in a different party. So some of the things that you both touched upon in terms of how we relate to the American people is also what they expect people who are in political office to relate to each other. So I know, Stacey, you worked on tax legislation, and Pete, you worked on the 1,000 housing initiative. And also as mayor, you just go to the supermarket and people are right there. So you have to relate to everybody on a very, very basic level. Talk to us a little bit about how you would translate what you've learned and what you've seen into, and what you've done politically, into how we have to bring this bipartisan rancor back together to a place where we're really talking and discussing things civilly and in a constructive way.
For 7 years in the Georgia legislature, I was minority leader, Democratic leader of the House. And I would tell my colleagues, my job, minority leader, was Latin for lose well. By its very nature, I would never have enough votes to accomplish any outcome unless I could work with the other side. And my rubric for that was, one, I didn't believe that we had to have conversion of beliefs, of ideology. My responsibility was not to convert you from believing whatever you held to be true, because I doubted you could do that to me. So what gave me the onus to think I could do it for you? And what arrogance is there to suggest that I should convert your ideology? I instead worked on convincing you that what we needed to do together had nothing to do with ideology and had more to do with outcome. And when we shift the focus from trying to change who a person is to trying to change how we do things, that moment of commonality, that moment of agreement allowed us to work together. We could be angry with each other and voting against each other the very next day, but in that space, we could work together.
Pete, you want to talk to us about your experiences as well?
Yeah, I think that point is really important. It's not always about making sure, somehow imagining that someone who views the world very differently is suddenly going to see the light and come to your way. It also, by the way, doesn't mean that you have to just kind of take the average and water down your own values and find somebody somewhere in between. Sometimes those things can melt away when it is about the outcome. So you mentioned one effort we had in the city when I was mayor, which was we had a huge number of vacant and abandoned properties, mostly in lower income areas, largely in historically Black neighborhoods, often owned by somebody who, it was just a line on a spreadsheet to them. They didn't even, it would be some large owner of multiple properties around the country, for whom the values of our homes in our neighborhoods had fallen so low that it wasn't even worth the bother of selling them or getting rid of them to some of these property owners. So we knew we had this huge problem and a need to fix up or remove as many of these properties as we can. That wound up being a really challenging thing to discuss politically. Who had felt abandoned by the city in many ways, wondering whether this was something that would be done to them. People who were looking at what was happening around the country and the phenomenon of gentrification, wondering if that was what this was meant. Now in a neighborhood where to this day you can get a pretty good house for $25,000, gentrification, at least right now, was not the main thing that was impacting the neighborhood. But why not expect that if your trust had been abused repeatedly by the economy and by the country? So we had to have a huge amount of dialogue in order to make sure that we were really authentically putting together a plan where everybody's voice was heard. And even then we made mistakes and had to change things as we went and adjust on the fly. It's all about, I think, good faith in the encounter, which again is not about agreeing. It's not about pretending to agree or believing that one side will convert the other in terms of their deepest values. It's about figuring out what we actually want to get done. And the thing I most fear right now is that we're not coming to that process even from the same field of fact. So if my interests or my values are different from your interests and your values, and we're arriving in good faith, then we can talk about it. I mean, as mayor, I might have somebody getting in the way of something I want to do in this neighborhood because they're a council member representing that neighborhood, and they view it as their job to fight for their area. And we just come together and we work something out. At the national level, putting together an agenda that's going to make sense for people with maybe radically different values, but not such different interests is possible, but not if we're literally in different realities. And that is the environment that we have increasingly wandered into. And it really strips us, I think, of the ability to reach across the aisle, to reach across competing sets of interests and values, because we're not even talking about the same thing.
Yeah. Well, I think we could talk to you, both of you, for hours. You're so open and so articulate, and you're talking from the heart, and we really appreciate spending time with us. We just have a few seconds left, and I'd just like to give you some time. We're going to have a big election on November 3rd, and people who need to trust in the government, who need to understand that we can come up with we can eliminate partisan rife. Can you just give one or two little thoughts to everybody about voting, the importance of voting? Pete, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I guess what I'd say is that everyone's moment of maximum power as a citizen is the moment that you fill in that ballot. And so for those who are still deciding whether to vote, and I know that's happening, it's worth remembering that it is precisely because we don't have any illusions about the problems in the system that we must engage the tools that it does give us. in order to make sure that we have a voice in fixing those problems. And we also know that in racially disparate ways, there are efforts to suppress that. And so there's a lot of work going on that Stacey and others are leading in order to make sure that we beat back those efforts to suppress the vote. But there are a lot of people where the suppression is actually a battle going on inside, and it's a battle to have some level of faith in an imperfect system. And the greatest faith we have to have in the system is not in its perfection, but in its capacity to be made more perfect. And that really is up to us.
Stacey?
I would add only one, that voting is not a magic pill. It's not an instant solution. It is part of the process of change. It's the process of making the choices we need to make day by day and abdicating that responsibility, or I think in a very logical way, deciding that it doesn't work for you. It does not mean that it can't work. We so often discard this notion as apathy, and I think it's often just despair. Why engage in a system that doesn't seem to recognize you, to recognize your value? But what I urge is to recognize that it's part of a larger ecosystem. Protesting in the streets to demand what we need, protesting at the ballot box to deliver the people to give it to us, and protesting in the halls of power to hold them accountable. And that cycle becomes a virtuous one when we recognize that the challenges we face never disappear. And so it's a constant process moving towards change, as opposed to this moment of realization where everything is fine and we can all take a nap. That's not how America works. That's not how life works. But the other piece, and this is what I learned at the LBJ school, we have to go all the way down the ballot. Most of the things that will change and affect our lives happen at the level where Pete operated, happened where I operated. It's city and county and school board, it's state legislatures. Yes, we need a president who is a good leader. Yes, we need a Congress that is functional, but we also need state and local leaders who see our challenges and our struggles and daily relief and are willing to do the work to help us. And so I urge everyone to not only believe in the perfection of our union, but also believe in the totality of our work. And that is, we have to work from the bottom to the top, and we have to work every day to make this country what we believe it can be.
Thank you, Stacey. Thank you, Mayor Pete, for giving us some inspirational thoughts, some challenges, and some hope. I really appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us, Dean.
It's an honor. Thanks for the chance to be with you.